Today's video, we're going under the hood, inside the skin, into the facilities of the NFL teams, because I am for the first time bringing on beat reporters from three separate teams. We have the New England Patriots, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we have the Indianapolis Colts. Why did I choose these three? These were just the first three beat reporters that actually answered me and are guys on Twitter that I really, really respect. This time of the summer, this time of the year, a lot of noise happens. You can get lost in the sauce. People in the fantasy industry just project without any sort of inside information, and I personally don't consume any fantasy football content outside of probably Establish the Run, but only beat reporter content. I want to know what's actually going on inside the practices, inside the facilities, which guys are running with the first team, which guys are running with the first string goal line offense, who is playing in three wide receiver sets, and this is the best way to do so. So I figured I wanted to go right to the source. I wanted to ask the questions that I am actually curious about. So if you guys like this video, let me know and I can continue to try to bring on different teams beat reporters. Let me know which questions you are begging to get answered. But I think today's video will be one of the more insightful ones that will help you prepare for your fantasy drafts, know which players to target, which players to stay away from based on their ADP, all right? So this video is going to be broken down into three separate interviews. I'm going to interview the Patriots beat reporter. I'm going to segue that in intro and then interview the Steelers beat reporter. And then I'm going to segue, intro, and interview the Colts beat reporter, all right? So all of the discussions and everything we talk about will be linked down below in the timestamps. Tony, make sure you break them up accordingly. And let's get into our very first interview. The first guy we're bringing on, and probably going to be the most popular dude that we bring on as it relates to the beat reporters on this series, is Evan Lazar of the New England Patriots. He's an official staff writer of the Patriots on Patriots.com. He is a senior reporter and the host of Patriots Catch 22. And you could follow him at EZLazar on Twitter, linked below.
2024 NFL Draft, the New England Patriots select Drake Maye.
Maye taking a shot, going for Nesbitt.
Throws it down near the goal line. Go Walker!
Maye, they said he can run, and Drake Maye
Gonna take a shot right down the chimney. And another beautiful toss. Just what they needed. Touchdown.
All right, Evan. So the first thing I kind of want to jump into is just the overall vibe of the team. You know, the energy around the Pats. Obviously, it feels like it's the first time in a long time we're seeing a little bit of like a change in direction here, right? No more Uncle Bill out there coaching the team and keeping everything strict and tidy over there. What's the overall energy of the team? Are they adopting well to the new style of just everything going on in the facility?
Yeah, it's a good question. The vibes have been pretty good. I would say that I do think that when you have a new coaching staff and they have a new coaching staff in all three phases of the game, a lot of these players probably feel like they have to carve out roles all over again to an extent, because they have to prove themselves to a whole new group of coaches and a whole new group of executives too in the front office. So there's definitely a competitiveness and a vibe that is a little bit different than what it's been in the last couple of years. But with that being said, this has not been an easy couple weeks of training camp for the players. I think a lot of people were under the assumption that Jerod Mayo would run a very player-friendly training camp and things would be subdued and there wouldn't be a whole lot of live contact and padded practices. But they've been in pads, I believe it's 6 out of the last 7 days. And 2 days ago, they were live tackling to the ground for the first time that I can remember in a Patriots practice in my time covering the Pats. So this wasn't just, a little bit of contact, thudding as they call it, when they just wrap people up and things like that. They were legitimately tackling like in a game in practice the other day in the open field, which is usually not something that you see in training camps nowadays. So it's been a much tougher, more physical camp than I was expecting. And I almost feel like Jerod Mayo is looking at it as a player and saying, well, what would get me ready for the season? And I'm going to do that versus I'm going to take it easy on these guys because I'm trying to be nice to them or something along those lines.
Yeah, I love it. They're setting the tone here. And something I noticed is Vegas kind of setting the tone on what they're expecting from Drake Maye. Now, obviously, that's the big change here, right? You got all the coaches and you've got some of the personnel, but Drake Maye, you take him top 5, you're expecting him to be the face of the franchise for a long time to come. When I'm looking at numbers in Vegas, they actually have Drake May's line for the year, and just in terms of passing yardage line, the lowest amongst all of the rookie QBs. Now, that's obviously not a sentiment to his skill level or that they think he's less talented than like a Bo Nix or a JJ McCarthy or whatever. It's probably more of an indication that they expect him to get onto the field later in the year than a lot of these other guys. Now, Jacoby Brissett was also, signed to the Patriots to be this veteran presence, this quarterback that kind of like bridges things between last year and Drake Maye. Now, I've read a bunch of your stuff and I've seen reports out of Pat's camp that Jacoby is really like adopting to this team and becoming a major like role player here. And that's something he's done really well throughout his career, obviously as a veteran. That's why he's probably still in this league, despite not being overly talented. I'm curious with this because we in the fantasy space try to project when a player is going to get on the field. We always look at like, oh, this is when their bye week is. This is probably when he's going to get on the field after that. Now the Pats have a bye week in, I think, like week 14. So that would be, crazy to try to predict it afterwards. Sometimes we look at schedules where like, oh, this stretch of 4 games is really tough. So Jacoby's probably going to play poorly, and then they make the move to Drake Maye. Now, with everything starting from scratch, I'm assuming that they're not going to really push Drake out there until they feel super comfortable that it's the right time there, right? And I've seen some consistent reports, some inconsistent reports about how Drake Maye is playing. I'm just assuming he's a rookie without a great surrounding, right? The O-line is not great. The weapons are starting to get a feel for it. What's the overall sentiment with like Drake Maye and maybe like a timetable of him getting onto the field? Is there maybe a chance that he doesn't even see the field in 2024 if Jacoby plays well?
Yeah, well, let's start with Jacoby because I think he's such a big part of this whole timeline. And the two things you have to remember with him are, one, he played in this offense with Alex Van Pelt, the Patriots' new offensive coordinator, in 2022 with the Cleveland Browns. He made 11 starts with the Browns that year and statistically played pretty well. He was 8th in the league in QBR as a starter that season. So it didn't necessarily represent itself in wins. The Browns didn't win a ton of games with him as the starter, but he personally was playing pretty well in those games. So they have a quarterback that knows the system, that knows his role in this entire rebuild in terms of mentorship and all that kind of stuff with Drake Maye. And they have this offense that has a lot of unknowns. Where's the pass catching group going to go? What's the offensive line going to look like? And do you want to put Drake Maye behind a line that might be deficient at both tackle spots in some respects going into the season? That's a lot to ask of a rookie quarterback to put him in that situation. So in some ways, it's that Jacoby Brissett's the most pro-ready quarterback that they have in the building, as Gerard Mayo put it. But in other ways, it's, fair or not to Jacoby, it's a little bit like, why don't you go take the lumps while we rebuild this offense structure around the quarterback and wait it out with Drake Maye. I would also just mention that Elliot Wolf, the Patriots' de facto general manager, his technical title is EVP of player personnel. He's from the Green Bay Packers school of GMing, right? His father, Ron Wolf's in the Hall of Fame, one of the best GMs of all time. We all know the Packers' history with quarterbacks and with sitting quarterbacks. I don't expect the Patriots to sit Drake Maye like the Packers sat Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love. Those situations were unique. They had Hall of Fame quarterbacks ahead of those two guys. Jacoby Brissett is not that. But I also think that Elliot Wolf will be very patient with what he does with Drake Maye because he's going to learn from his father and from the Packer way of not rushing quarterbacks onto the field until they're ready. So my guess is that they split the atom there somewhere where it's not that Drake Maye sits the entire year, but they really wait until he's 110% ready to roll him out there. So I still expect him to play this season. I would say maybe he ends up playing 8 or 9 games, somewhere around Halloween. I think is a good time to expect him to be in the conversation to start games. And what we've seen in practice has been ups and downs for sure. Certainly early on in training camp in those padded practices, his first couple padded practices were a little bit rough, but now he's doing just fine and he's showing some steady progress each day and he looks more comfortable with every practice. So I think he's on target to play as a rookie, but the Patriots had this plan coming in of Jacoby Brissett bridging the gap, Drake Maye sitting for a little while, and I don't think that they're going to just allow a couple of training camp practices and preseason games to just throw the entire plan out the door and roll Drake Maye out there week 1 against the Bengals. So it's a long way of saying that I expect Drake Maye to play this year. but probably not play the entire year.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I wouldn't try to throw them into the fire either with the surrounding cast they've got there, but that is what we're trying to figure out for fantasy football. So I want to jump into the receivers on the team. Now, this is like low-key one of the more exciting groups of players I think we've had in New England as it relates to the skill players, because we've got Pop Douglas, who by all accounts played really, really well for a later round rookie last year. And from what I've heard out of camp, he's probably like one of the few real explosive playmakers in the group. And then, I watched film on most of the incoming rookies, and I really like Jalen Polk coming out, and I really like Javon Baker. So I thought they did a great job of double tapping that receiver room in the draft. From a fantasy perspective, we don't expect this offense, passing offense at least, to be very like high volume and probably not going to throw more than 20, 22 touchdowns or something like that. So Polk is probably my favorite under the radar upside play. Pop Douglas, I think he's a great reception guy. He'll probably catch a lot of passes. I guess my question is, do we expect this team to be super run heavy, or do we see them lean into maybe what one of their strengths are now in these playmakers? And with the rookies of like Polk and Javon Baker, how much of an impact do we see them playing? On top of that, Pop feels like a slot-only receiver. When they're in 12 personnel, 2 wide receiver sets, yeah, is he going to come off the field despite maybe being their best playmaker? Like, is he only going to play 60% of the snaps this year? Whereas Jalen Polk, he might have the advantage where he's not maybe as comfortable as Pop yet, but he'll be on the field a lot more often. So who do you think, based on what you've seen, are like realistic targets that we should kind of keep an eye on throughout the summer and early season?
Yeah, it's a great point about Pop Douglas, and one that I've echoed a lot about this offense. They want to be a run-heavy offense. Good. They've made that abundantly clear. Gerard Mayo has told us that they want to run the football. They're going to play good defense. They're going to try to control the game on offense and win games that way for now. Eventually they hope that Drake Maye emerges and he's the franchise quarterback that they drafted 3rd overall, and then they can put it more on his shoulders and let him go out there and sling it. But for now, this year, that's how they feel like their formula is best suited to win games. And that's how this offense is run in Cleveland and in other places at times as well that mimic this type of offense that they're trying to incorporate here with Alex Van Pelt. So I definitely feel like they're going to run the ball a lot. They have 2 running backs they like a lot, rhamondre Stevenson and Antonio Gibson. I know we're going to get to them in a second, so I won't talk too much about them right now. So let's go back to the receivers. I love your point about Pop Douglas. I am the biggest Pop Douglas fan. I saw him at the Shrine Bowl. I was really excited that they drafted him. But in this offense, when you start to think about the archetypes of receivers that run in this type of West Coast system, you start to think about guys that are bigger, that are capable of blocking, that can play on the outside. I always point to the Rams, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, like those types of players, Green Bay, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, those types of players. Those guys are not Pop Douglas. So when I look at Pop Douglas's early down role in this system, I don't know if it's necessarily there outside of him potentially being on the field for jet motion, orbit, things like that, where they're just showing motion pre-snap. And on occasion, maybe he takes one of those handoffs on an end around or something like that. But it's really just there to horizontally stretch the defense and cause, chaos on the defensive side of the ball with motion. So that might happen a little bit, but I look at their base offense, if you will, and I see guys like when Kendrick Bourne's healthy, KJ Osborne, Pop Douglas, Jalen Polk, Javon Baker. Those guys, to me, fit more of what they're going to want to do on 1st and 2nd down. That being said, I still expect Pop to be rosterable just in the fact that 3rd down, man coverage, got to have it. He's probably their best pure. He's not probably. He is their best pure separator on the roster still. So he's still someone that's going to get targeted. But in terms of high volume, I don't necessarily see it with him right now because I just mentioned all those things and we talked about the personnel and all that kind of stuff. But B, he's 185, 190 pounds, and keeping him healthy is something that was a little bit of a problem last year. He got nicked up here and there. And my guess is that they don't look at him as a guy that's 125 target a year guy, right, just because of all those reasons. So I love where your mind is at with Jalen Polk. I think you're spot on. What we've seen in practice with those 2 rookies is Jalen Polk is the consistent, steady, underneath target, We here in New England have compared him a bunch to Jacoby Myers. That just is the type of field player that we see with him. And then Javon Baker is going to be the splash play guy. Like, he's going to be the down the field player. He's going to make the acrobatic catches and the highlight reels and all those types of things. But the guy that's going to be the volume guy, the guy that's going to be the straw that stirs the drink, is going to be Jalynn Polk. So if I had to draft anybody in fantasy, it's tough because I think all these guys are going to be very situational and role specific. And with Pop and Jalynn Polk, you worry about touchdown production. Are they going to be guys that are going to find the end zone? With Javon Baker, you worry about volume and consistency. So it's a tough one to say which one of those guys is going to emerge. I'd probably lean towards drafting Polk ahead of everybody just because of the volume that I expect him to get. But I do feel like he won't be the touchdown guy. That's probably going to be more like Hunter Henry and Rhamondre and those types of players.
Yeah, let's move right into the running back room because I have equally as many concerns for Rhamondre. Now, I think we have enough evidence that he's a good football player. He's a good running back that you can keep on the field for all 3 downs. But when I look at what's important in fantasy football, it's catching passes a lot of the time and scoring touchdowns. Now, obviously, the upside of scoring touchdowns, I don't know how realistic it is to project him to score anything more than, 6, maybe 7 on the ground, something like that. Now, Antonio Gibson signing, I want to talk a little bit more about that because I haven't heard his name really at all this offseason, so I didn't know if he was practicing, if he was hurt or anything, but he's the type of player that pisses you off in fantasy football if you draft Rhamondre Stevenson, because Gibson, I don't think he's a very good runner, but I think he's a great athlete and a really good pass catcher. So if I'm looking at a dude like Rhamondre and his valuable seasons in fantasy come because he's seeing, 60, 70 targets, I kind of feel like Gibson's going to come in there and play that 2 and 4 minute drill role, pass catching role, and really suck a lot of the value out of Rhamondre Stevenson. So if you take his targets, kind of maybe cut them in half, and then you're talking about a guy who is playing behind probably a subpar offensive line, not a ton of holes, doesn't have great breakaway speed. How many touchdowns is this offense going to score? Rhamondre, he has a lot of red flags around drafting him in fantasy football for me. Can you talk a little bit about Antonio Gibson, what he's been doing this summer, and what kind of role you think he's going to play in the offense?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. With Antonio Gibson, I am pretty excited about him just being on this football team. I know that doesn't necessarily help you guys in the fantasy world, but he's somebody that with that speed is, the Patriots don't have a ton of game breakers on the offensive side of the ball. And we all really like Rhamondre here, but Rhamondre doesn't have those types of wheels in the open field to break big plays. So I look at Antonio Gibson, and I do think that there is a role for him to cut into Rhamondre's workload quite a bit, not only just in the passing game, but they want to be very outside zone heavy, very stretch run heavy. And if you're going to get a back that can get out on the perimeter and then, bounce runs back up through the middle and really gash teams, usually those backs are guys that got that kind of top end speed. We're talking about the guy that I always look at with Gibson is like a Raheem Mostert in Miami, right? Somebody like that that's got some real track speed. That's Gibson more than it is Rhamondre. Now, they've said that they're going to be flexible with how they block things up if it's not working with the outside zone, because their line doesn't necessarily scream outside zone in terms of personnel, and Rhamondre doesn't necessarily scream outside zone in terms of his skill set. So I do think that they are going to try to run some gap and try to manipulate it that way. But I do believe that Antonio Gibson is going to be a big part of what they do. The sell job that they've told us with Gibson and Rhamondre is that Rhamondre is sort of like Nick Chubb and Gibson's going to sort of be like Kareem Hunt. But I wouldn't say that Rhamondre is as good as Nick Chubb, right? So
hopefully
that's
not, yeah.
a tough spot there where, you can't really sign up for Rhamondre being like one of the best, producers in the NFL at the running back position. So that's the tough part about this backfield, is that they are going to be situational and they are going to sort of, handcuff each other. So if I was in fantasy world, I would probably still lean towards Rhamondre just because he's going to be the most used early down back in this offense. They just paid him, so they're going to use him. There's no doubt about that. But it is going to be tough in terms of pass catching production and then just overall big playability and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's kind of disappointing to hear. He's such a fun player, and it's cool that he got the extension and everything. But I think we're all pretty rightfully cool on him as it pertains to fantasy football. Evan, we're gonna leave you at that. I know you got to get to practice or whatnot, get ready for the game tomorrow. Any parting words? Any hot takes or bold predictions for the year that you want to get on record before we get you out of here?
It's a good question. I really feel like, we talked a little bit about Jalynn Polk. I'm pretty excited about what I've seen from him so far in terms of being able to play right away and have a high volume in this Patriots offense. Like I said earlier, I'm not sure if touchdown production is going to necessarily be his MO, but I haven't seen a rookie receiver in New England in a while that has taken on as much responsibility in practice as early as Jalynn Polk has. We saw flashes from Tyquan early, then pads came on, and that sort of waned. N'Keal Harry just never looked like he belonged on an NFL field. So the bar is not very high. I give you that. But Jalynn Polk definitely seems like a guy that looks polished, looks ready to contribute right away. And I know that they're pretty excited about him. And not that they're not excited about Baker as well, but if I had to guess which guy is going to come out of this season as, in terms of stats, the number one receiver in New England, I'd say it's probably Jalynn Polk.
All right, Polk to the moon then. You heard it here first. Evan, thank you again for joining us. Make sure you are following him on Twitter at Lazar. And that is all for now. Thanks, Evan.
No problem.
Next up in the interview series, we've got Nick Farabaugh of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He is the beat reporter for Penn Live, and he is the host of the Steelers Breakdown. You can follow him on Twitter at Farabaugh FB, also linked down below.
Bootleg left, throws for the end zone, touchdown Steelers, Pat Freiermuth, his second of the year. Over the middle is caught by Pickens, he's on his way, he's at the 40, the 50, the 45, the 40. Here comes George Pickens all the way for a Pittsburgh Steelers touchdown.
What a Christmas treat!
Back, and the ball is out, and the Steelers pick it up, and that's T.J. Watt running for the end zone. Steelers with the
All right, Nick, so right before we jumped on the call here, you were saying it's aiyuk everywhere. Everything is Brandon Aiyuk right now. As we know, they're in trade talks, the Niners and the Steelers. We're filming this on the 7th, so by the time this comes out, Aiyuk might be a Steeler. Aiyuk might have a contract extension in San Fran. Aiyuk might be a Falcon for all we know. We don't know. But I am curious to hear, I guess, the energy that's going on in the building around Pittsburgh. I mean, you guys got to be super excited about just the possibility of getting a player like Brandon Aiyuk added to the mix over there. So talk a little bit about what's to come with the Brandon Aiyuk hype right now.
Dude, the energy around Latrobe right now is crazy. It's amped up. Mike Tomlin, was asked today if he planned to add it to the depth chart, and he basically said, I'll let you guys speculate on that, but then he gave, that little smirk Mike Tomlin does, smile. He sees the stuff. He hears it, obviously. He went on a DVE morning radio show, which is one of the top channels here in Pittsburgh, and was asked if he had made any calls this morning and said, it's early for the West Coast. It's early for me to make a call on the West Coast. I mean, he's just playing into it.
Sure.
Mike Tomlin knows that I think it's getting close, or at least the Steelers are deep in talks here. And you could feel his energy kind of radiate throughout the rest of the team. And even, the wide receivers, like I talk with Van Jefferson and different guys, like they all know Brandon Aiyuk is a special kind of player that the Steelers don't have right now. So you see the energy. The Steelers don't make moves like this, man. Like that's something. They don't do this.
Right.
So if they do end up making this move and Brandon Aiyuk does become a Pittsburgh Steeler, it's the first time in a very long time we have seen something like this happen with the Steelers. Even the Minkah Fitzpatrick trade doesn't really stack up to this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here in Pittsburgh, obviously, but we'll try to continue this conversation as if Aiyuk does not land in Pittsburgh, I guess, and we could speculate a little bit as we go from topic to topic. But the biggest change this offseason was obviously bringing in Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. Now, Russ is not going to play in their first preseason game. Justin Fields will get the start. Russ has missed a lot of time so far at training camp, which has kind of left the door open for Fields to, go out there and show what he has if he wants to compete for that QB1 spot. Now, I'm of the belief that I feel like Mike Tomlin probably wants the stability of a veteran like Russ under center until he proves that he shouldn't have the job anymore. So my thinking, and you let me know if this is crazy. This is bonkers here, but like I wouldn't be overly shocked if they start using both of them in tandem a little bit, where Fields plays a little bit like a Taysom Hill role, and I know that's kind of out of left field, but he's a great athlete. I could see him getting on the field and maybe using both of them at the same time. You don't know if they're going to run, they're going to pass. I know when they first started OTAs, they were saying he might be back there for like kick returns, which is obviously nonsense, but it's overall energy of like what Justin Fields brings to this team. So, give me a glimpse into like what the quarterback, I guess, battle per se, which hasn't been really much right now, is kind of playing itself out to be.
Yeah, Russell Wilson's first like full day back was yesterday. So that was really the first day you kind of felt the energy of it. But I still think Russell Wilson has, as Mike Tomlin says, pole position. I think that is where we're at. I think Justin Fields has played really well in practice. I just don't think it's the setting where he's going to win the battle, though. I think if he wins the battle, it's going to be in these preseason games. Because, listen, Justin Fields, a lot of his production, one of his best traits is his legs, and you can't really quantify it when you can't be touched in practice.
All right.
You can see the explosiveness in what he does, but you can't really see it fully. So I do think that's going to be interesting. With Russ out on Friday, I think this is going to be a big opportunity for Justin Fields. He's going to get opportunities against the Texans as starters. So if he can play really well and showcase what he can do, he can eat into the cushion Russ has. I just think Russ has to do things to lose the battle. As you said, I think veteran stability, the pedigree that Russ brings, I think Mike Tomlin runs to that. Like Russ brings a high floor, I think, to certain things. They know what he can do. He's got a great deep ball. And the basic plan of the Steelers offense this year is to run the ball and then hit play action deep shots. Russell Wilson can probably do that if you can run the ball efficiently. So I think that's really where everything comes into. But then you talk about the two quarterback stuff. I don't know if we'll see Justin Fields and Russell Wilson on the field together, but I'm not going to be surprised if we see goal line packages for Justin Fields to run the ball. If we see specific packages where he would come in if he's not the starter. He's too dynamic. They have to use his legs. They have to use what he brings to the table in some instances just because he is such a weapon. Teams fear Justin Fields on the ground. There's no doubt about it. They fear him. And so I think you have to use that weapon. And Arthur Smith has been pretty good, actually, about developing QB run game. Really did a nice job with Marcus Mariota when he had him in Atlanta. So I think that's going to be something you'll see. I think you're going to see Justin Fields packages, if you will, if he's not the starter. And again, right now, it's not a sham competition. I don't think I'd go that far, but I do think Russell Wilson has to do things to lose it in order for Justin Fields to be the week one starter.
Okay, so let's jump into Arthur Smith because you brought him up, and I'm actually a Falcons fan, so I was very keen on what was happening throughout the Arthur Smith saga there. I actually think he's very creative. I think he runs a really good offense. I think the head coaching just became probably a little bit too much for him, and there was not much for him to do with Desmond Ridder at QB. Like reports are having Desmond Ridder losing the backup job to Clayton Tune at this point throughout the summer. So like that kind of tells you the quality of QB play that he had last year in Atlanta. Now, when I look at the similarities between Pittsburgh's offense this year and Atlanta's offense last year, I'm like, he gets a second shot at running this offense again. Arthur Smith does, but with a more stable, accurate QB in Russell Wilson, right? As opposed to Desmond Ridder. And they want to utilize multiple running backs. They have one very strong pass catching weapon, George Pickens to Drake London. They've also, you're an offensive line enthusiast per your Twitter bio. They've invested heavy draft capital into their dudes up front. So this went from like a liability to an asset within probably, a year or two turnaround time. And that's what Arthur Smith wants to do. Like we saw it back in Tennessee when they had a really good run blocking line, what they were able to do with Derrick Henry. As bad of a rap as Arthur Smith gets now because of how it ended, like he produced big years out of Cordarrelle Patterson. Tyler Algier was a day 3 pick that went over 1,000 yards on the ground. He misutilized Bijan last year. It's no secret, but for the most part, Arthur has a really good resume as an offensive coordinator, and I think runs a really creative offense. So like I am more optimistic about this offense than I think a lot of people are. Can you talk about the offensive line additions? Like, are you optimistic about the offensive line? And you say that they're going to run the ball a ton. Like, I like both Najee and Jalynn Warren this year in fantasy football because you talk about Deontay Johnson being out of the picture. That's like 130, 40 targets a year, no longer there. So I'd imagine that while they're going to run the ball a lot, they're also probably going to shield their quarterbacks by the way of like dump offs to Najee. He was so good at that his rookie year. Jalynn Warren, obviously no secret that he's a great pass catching back. So like talk a little bit about how you see this offense playing out. the vibes with Arthur Smith, because they were as bad as they could be in Atlanta. But I'd imagine, he's probably winning some people back in Pittsburgh now.
Yeah, well, one thing you talk about is how bad he was in Atlanta, and then you look at what Matt Canada did in Pittsburgh. I think that's a big part of this. It's hard to be worse than what Matt Canada did. A lot of guys didn't even know why they were running certain plays against certain looks. The detail alone that Arthur Smith brings, and he brings a lot of details, is a significant upgrade. He's fiery. He brings a certain type of energy. I think, Arthur Smith is going to be a decent OC for them. I think he fits what they want to do. I do have questions about the Russell Wilson fit specifically. You're talking about an offense that throws over the middle of the field a lot, and Russell Wilson does not do that. For whatever reason, I think part of it might be that he can't, anticipate and see over the offensive line to a degree. And so I think that's an interesting part of this fit. But I do think, as you mentioned, multiple running backs, multiple tight ends. I think Pat Freiermuth is really going to be featured in this offense where, he's how Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith kind of moved around the formation at times last year. There is no Jonnu Smith, though. So Pat Freiermuth should get a lot.
What about Big Darnell? Is he going to be the tight end too there? Are they going to ask him to block a lot? Will he be running routes?
Yeah, I imagine they will. He's going to be a big time blocking tight end. For them. I don't think he's going to be a high volume target in the pass game.
Sure.
He could be a guy that has 20 receptions and 6 touchdowns. I mean, he could be a touchdown stealer in the red zone. He could do what Michael Pruitt did to a degree last year, where he's a guy in the red zone where you just target him, and it makes sense. I mean, he's 6'7". I mean, if you throw it up to him, good shot, he can bring that down. And Arthur Smith is going to use all those tight ends. I also think you're just going to see, more 2 wide receivers. So theoretically, let's say the aiyuk thing does happen. I mean, you're going to be running play action deep shots with George Pickens on one side and Brandon Aiyuk on the other. It's, to be quite honest with you, it's hard to mess that up.
Right.
I mean, it is. And Russell Wilson's plenty accurate enough to get that working. So I think Arthur Smith is bringing new things to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has routinely, whether it's under Matt Canada, Randy Fichtner, Todd Haley, not used play action. They've been low in motion. They have been kind of in the dark ages of offensive football. At the very least, what Arthur Smith brings to the table is more of a modern type. And so they'll be in a new kind of era of offense. So I do think we're going to see those running backs be the focal point. And one more thing I'm going to say is, in terms of getting guys receptions, I think the screen game is going to be huge, the running back screen game specifically. So Jalen Warren and Najee Harris, if you are in, for example, in fantasy in a PPR league, easy money points there. These guys are probably going to get, a few screens per game. So it's going to be a significant part of the offense, an extension of the run game, if you will.
Okay, and you mentioned that, the guys in the Steelers locker room, when they think about Aiyuk, they're like, we don't have a guy like that. Is that, from your point of view, is that maybe saying that George Pickens has enough flaws in his game that you kind of question that he can have that Brandon Aiyuk breakout type year? Because, I mean, he had a good rookie year, 800-plus yards. Last year, he quietly went over 1,100-plus. So the trajectory is there. He's been a little bit more boom-bust, but I'd imagine fitting into that wide receiver 1 role, he's going to be the top targeted player on this team. I don't really see, a path where he's not the guy. Do you not see, a real path to almost, superstardom, or at least statistically speaking, him being a top receiver in the league?
I think there's a path. I do. He's worked on his intermediate routes this year. A lot of the balls he's caught in training camp have been over the middle on intermediate routes. We haven't seen him really run a lot of goes down the sideline, for example. That's not really what Arthur Smith does anyway. So he himself, I think, has the potential to have a more efficient season, which is crazy to say because his yards per catch last year was already kind of insane in lieu of whatever Matt Canada was doing with him. But I do think there is a path there. It's just with Aiyuk, you see the totality of his game to fit Arthur Smith's. Aiyuk is the perfect Arthur Smith wide receiver.
Yeah.
He blocks behind off. He wins over the middle. He makes tough catches. He's a really good route runner that beats man and zone. I mean, he's kind of the perfect Arthur Smith guy. George Pickens, on the other hand, I do think this is kind of where, how is Pickens' attitude kind of going to be, right? Is he going to block? Is he going to do these things? I think that is where, you kind of ask, okay, where is Pickens going to be at in terms of his ceiling? I do think George Pickens could have a huge year. I just think Aiyuk is the proven all-around guy. And so, I think that's where I'm coming from when I say that. But I don't want to downplay George Pickens at all. He's really having a good camp, and he's winning in ways that he didn't last year. So I think that's That's encouraging. I just need to see it in a game first because that's been the one weak area of George Pickens' game has been that intermediate route running part of his game. And I think if he has that, I think he's got really underrated skills after the catch. So I think he can turn, 20-yard gains into 70-yard touchdowns. So
Yeah.
it could be a huge year for him.
Yeah, that does get me excited for if he's running more intermediate routes, like those slants are things that he can catch, at 8-10 yards and take all the way to the house. So that's if we see an uptick in that, I'd imagine we'll see some big yardage games from Pickens. And one of the things I really like about this offense is that it is so condensed. They don't have a ton of playmakers, so you kind of know that the ball is going to Pickens, Pat, Warren, or Najee. Now, Cordell Patterson coming over from Atlanta, obviously following Arthur Smith there. Do you think Cordell, like when I look at fantasy, when I think of guys like Najee, I'm like, Najee feels like a really high floor dude that I'd be cool having as my, running back 2 on my fantasy team. Will probably score 7 or 8 touchdowns. We'll have 1,100 total yards, whatever. But you also have to look for the underlying like annoying players on the roster that might start to steal. Like if I'm thinking about Najee, now, the Justin Fields conversation comes in. It's like, does Justin Fields take, 5 goal line carries this year? Does Cordell Patterson come in and take 3 to 5 goal line carries this year and really lower the ceiling and the floor of these guys? Do we see Cordell Patterson actually having a role in this backfield, or is he more of like a locker room veteran presence, special team type player? Like what's Cordell Patterson been doing so far this summer?
Yeah, well, he's been out because he has a hamstring injury, which
Okay.
I think limits kind of his ability to be implemented into the offense fully, but he knows the offense. So I don't
Yeah.
think he needs it as much as, other guys. Here's what I think Cordell Patterson's here for. One, I think kick returns is the obvious one. The new kick
Yeah.
return rules, that's where he's going to shine. I do think they'll use him a little bit in, multiple running back sets where maybe they have Jalynn and Cordero or Najee and Cordero on the field. I don't really expect him to vulture much of the carries. He'll get some work. I don't think he's going to get a tremendous amount of work, but I think they'll use his flexibility around in these multiple running back sets that we've started to see. Honestly, the vulture for Najee Harris's touchdowns at the goal line could very well be Jaylen Warren himself.
Okay.
I mean, he's taken a lot more goal line reps this camp, which has been interesting. He's actually been out repping Najee Harris on the goal line. So I don't. It's interesting to me. I don't know if that's the plan, but I think Jaylen Warren might actually be the guy to watch here. In which case, that obviously boosts Warren's fantasy viability.
Yeah, I mean, he's got a lot of hype this offseason, and for good reason. He's been one of the most efficient backs on a per touch basis over the last couple of years. Reminds me a little bit of like Austin Eckler in the early Chargers days when Melvin Gordon was the guy, and it took him holding out for us to see like who Eckler could become, because Warren can play all 3 downs and brings an explosiveness to this offense that they're pretty sorely lacking. Is there, in your opinion, Najee feels like such a safe floor play and such a part of this offense that it limits Warren's upside? Do you think there's any path this year where Warren starts to become, a 65%, 70% opportunity player where he's just like the clear starter and Najee's almost like a breather back for him?
No, I don't think that's going to be the case.
Okay.
I don't see that. The Steelers really like Najee, even if they turn down his 5th-year option, and Arthur Smith really likes Najee.
Yeah.
Najee has outsnapped Jaylen Warren throughout most of these first-team periods, too. Not to a significant degree. It's more like 55-45 in favor of Najee. I just don't see Warren taking that mantle from him anytime soon. It's not because I don't think Warren's better. I think he is, honestly. I think it's just because the Steelers look at Najee Harris and look at him as an old bell cow back.
It's
and
their
Mike
identity.
Tomlin loves these guys, man.
Right.
And, I mean, there's really only maybe 2 other running backs in the NFL that are built like Najee. Obviously, one's Derrick Henry. Maybe you can throw, a guy like A.J. Dillon in there who kind of has a similar frame. But, this guy looks like an old bell cow back. And so the Steelers like his dependability because he doesn't get hurt. I think that's another thing. He has played every single game of his career possible to this point. And so I just do not think it's going to happen. I don't even know if I say it should. I do think Jaylen Warren's better. But I'm not sure how Jaylen Warren would be exposed to a higher dosage of carries. Like, he's super efficient right now. He's a great tackle breaker. But I would be curious if they did go 65-35, just how much Jaylen Warren's efficiency would hold up. I think that's a question we don't really have the answer to. I haven't seen Jaylen Warren carry 20-25 in the NFL. In college, he was really good at, but I don't really know how it would hold up in the NFL. But either way, I just don't think the Steelers brass is going to think like that to give Jaylen Warren a significant amount of carries in that manner.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we've seen that type of experiment happen where it's gone well for a guy like Eckler, but then you see last year in Dallas where it's like, all right, let's give Tony Pollard the mantle, and that didn't go well when Zeke was finally out of there. So it's not something that I would imagine is going to happen just based on, like you said, Najee's build and just like his stability in the offense in the backfield. And a lot of people in fantasy like to be like, all right, look at all these like small sample size numbers for Jaylen Warren. He has to get 90% of the touches, but it's obviously like the real life factor of it and bringing that toughness and that bigger back onto the field as it relates to Najee. So I think that's really all the questions I had for you that was fantasy relevant. Is there anything that I'm missing that I might be overlooking in this offense? I'm not really excited about any wide receiver 2 from a statistical standpoint, albeit, obviously if aiyuk comes over, that changes the picture. But I was not a huge fan of Roman Wilson coming out of Michigan. I've heard a lot of hype about Van Jeff as the 2 there. Is there, anything that you think I might be overlooking here as it relates to fantasy?
In terms of dependable options, probably not. Roman Wilson maybe later in the season I think could be a legitimate option. I think he'll actually be the 3. If, let's say, aiyuk comes over, he'll be the 3. He'll be the full-time slot, but Arthur Smith's team doesn't really use the slot that much. So I wouldn't call him super dependable, especially because he's out right now with the ankle injury. So I wouldn't bet on him. I think Van Jefferson will get work. Probably not enough to be fantasy relevant. The one guy I think you maybe should keep an eye on is Calvin Austin III. I think he's like the late round dart you could throw. I think he's going to play fairly similarly to how the Lions and Arthur Smith in Tennessee used Khalif Raymond, where they're going to give him some deep targets. So he'll be like a boomer bust option probably a lot of the time. But I think he could end up being relevant if he has 30 catches and like 6 or 7 touchdowns just on deep shots. So I do think he's someone to look out for because he's done that a lot in camp. They've been using him a lot, running deep routes, and he's had a pretty good camp. So I think he's someone to watch, but obviously I think you would have to be in a deep league and need to have a dart throw to put it at that. So other than, an aiyuk Pickens pairing, I wouldn't touch that.
All right. Well, you've heard it from the man himself. Nick, thank you so much for joining. His Twitter will be linked down below at Farabaugh FB. Go get us some more scoops, and we'll see you on the Twitter sphere. Our third and final interview for today's video is Kevin Bowen of the Indianapolis Colts. He has been covering them since 2011. He is the radio host for The Wake Up Call and does content for 1075 The Fan.
Right side, Deion Jackson. Richardson going to take off and run. He's in there! Touchdown! I-N-D-Y! Takes it now. He's going to screen it left side to Pittman. He's got it creases at the 20, 15, 10, 5 racing for the pylon. He's in! Touchdown! Touchdown, Michael Pittman Jr. Plants in the pocket. He's hit as he throws. The ball is out. There's a fight for it around the 35-yard line.
Get the ball.
The play's still going. Pick it up. The Colts pick it up. It's DeForest Buckner. He's at the 10. He's at the 5. Stretching for the pylon. Touchdown!
All right, Kevin. So jumping right in, I think the best way to start is to start with Anthony Richardson, right? That's where the season started last year. He came out on fire, scoring a bunch of touchdowns, and I think there's probably a lot of excitement around him coming into this year. When I look at the offense overall, I don't see a ton of flaws here. I think they have a great receiver room. We'll obviously have to kind of jump into what just happened to Josh Downs and his high ankle sprain, but I see a lot of excitement, and there are a lot of moving parts, right? You have Rich being the face of the franchise. You have the extension with Jonathan Taylor. You have a really good receiving room. You have a really underrated and strong offensive line. Do you think the way that Steichen has set up the offense, they're going to be as run-heavy as most people anticipate with the combo of Richardson and JT? Or do you think they let him unleash the ball a little bit more, with his arm and let that cannon kind of loose a little bit this year? Will people be surprised?
Yeah, I think they will be pretty run-heavy. I mean, they really didn't uncork, I think, the true deep ball out of Richardson. If I'm not mistaken, I want to say he had 5 pass plays over 25 yards in his brief stint playing last year. And if you watch the plays, I think one's like a screen and run. I want to say another was some sort of dump off or kind of a lot of yak. Again, not like the traditional, like, boom, you've got 7, 8 staying in to protect, and you're really going to, play action the defense to death, if you will. But I mean, you'd be naive to pay Taylor the amount of money you're paying him and pay the offensive line the amount of money you're paying them and then abandon that. So I do think they'll be run heavy, but I think they will try to build in a few more shots than maybe we saw them take last year.
Yeah, I want to kind of zone in on that point, specifically with Michael Pittman, because Pittman, as I remember him coming out of USC, he was still very much a lot of the same player he is now and developed into sort of a kind of underrated superstar in the league, I think, at the receiver position. But he was a pretty good downfield threat as a Trojan, and they don't seem to use him downfield whatsoever. I don't know if that was a quarterback thing, having an older Matt Ryan or whatever overlap they had with these veteran QBs that haven't really hit for the Colts, and not having someone with an arm like Anthony Richardson. But for someone who caught so many passes, I'm looking back at last year's numbers, and less than 9% of his targets were deep balls, which were it was the second lowest rate in the entire league amongst wide receivers. They seem to love to utilize him around the line of scrimmage, especially on like those screens where he gets it a couple yards behind and he's able to like shake and bake a little bit. Do you think with Anthony Richardson's arm strength, they look to utilize Pittman downfield a little bit more?
Yeah, first, I think it's a good assessment of Pittman so far in the NFL. I mean, I watched a lot of USC when he was in college, and I did think he was kind of a 50-50 high point ball, down the field type of guy, more than we've seen so far. If you want to pick out one year, he has kind of been that. Honestly, I think it was with Carson Wentz.
Yeah.
And so that's sandwiched around Phillip Rivers and Matt Ryan and Gardner Minshew. I don't think we think of any of those three as, great sort of, they're just ready to air it out vertically all day long. But I also think Pittman's skill set is more of a power forward, if you will, playing wide receiver. I mean, he's a physical dude. He plays mean. I've said about Pittman many times, there's no USC pretty boy in him when he plays the game of football. And I think stylistically, you watch that at wideout, and it is a guy that kind of bullies you and kind of out-physicals you underneath stuff, and then, maybe tap into some of that yards after catch. I think one of the big plays with Richardson was that screen and run, and it was Pittman making that play. So we've probably seen a few more of that in training camp than we have in years past. Again, I think Alec Pierce and AD Mitchell, if you're really going to dial things up vertically, those probably jump a little bit more out at you, just like concentrated specific plays. But certainly if Pittman's playing 95% of the snaps, inevitably he's going to fall into a couple of those. So I do think you'll see a little bit more of that, but I also don't think it's going to be abundantly more.
Yeah, I hope we do, because I think that's one of the hesitations that a lot of fantasy players have when drafting a dude like Pittman is like, does he carry that upside that some of the premier receivers in the league do, because they have the ability to, take a 60-yard bomb to the house, where that happens so rarely for a dude like Michael Pittman. But let's keep going down the receiver path there, because we got news just a few hours ago, depending on when you guys are watching this. We're filming it on the 7th. Josh Downs suffered a high ankle sprain in practice. I love Josh Downs coming out of UNC. He reminded me of like Steve Smith at the point of attack when the ball was in the air. I don't think the stats that he put up last year are indicative of who he really is as a player and how good he is as a player. And then the draft pick of AD Mitchell, I think he's a phenomenal route runner also. And I think that group together, what they've built there is pretty special. And they have Alec Pierce mixing in, who, he's a bigger dude. I think he runs routes pretty well downfield, but I kind of think he'll be overtaken sooner rather than later with AD Mitchell. Now, the sentiment around Josh Downs' ankle, he's on a 4 to 6 week timetable. We know these high ankle sprains tend to linger into the season. Is there any sort of, I know this happened like very, very recently, so maybe you're not really like up to speed on what the energy is inside of the facility right now. Is there a negative energy around it? Is there optimism towards Josh Downs being ready for the season, or how should we be looking at him?
Yeah, I mean, we're recording this just a couple hours after that injury happened. It didn't look good on the field. I mean, he had to be helped off and was extremely ginger and trying to put any weight on that ankle. And unfortunately, I thought it was a pretty avoidable injury. Obviously, I only really watched the Colts in training camp, but, today's NFL, you don't tackle. And This was a tackle from behind on Josh Downs in a 7-on-7 setting as well. It just kind of adds in, in the open field. It's not like, pile and guys get tripped up and, it's just hard to control that. So I think that's the big bummer to it. And if you look at the Colts schedule right out of the gate, there's some marquee games. I know from a fantasy standpoint that not might matter too much, but I think that, is something to keep an eye on. And he played through some banged up stuff last season, and I think he was super eager and was easily one of the Colts' best players, period. It honestly crossed my thought, eerily enough, minutes before he got hurt, I thought to myself, you know what, could he catch more balls than Michael Pittman Jr. this season? And that's a big compliment in my eyes because, I fully expect Pittman Jr. to be, heavily peppered with targets. So certainly monitor that. A little bit more explosive playmaking, I think, is something the Downs wanted. But, in terms of the next age of slot wideouts in this league, I see no reason why Downs won't be that.
Yeah, so now with Downs out, let's say, for all intents and purposes, let's say he misses like 2 to 3 weeks into the regular season, or at some point this injury comes back, lingers, and he misses time. Do you see the Colts just forcing another slot receiver to take his role, or does this now open it up for just Pierce and Adonai to play together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Michael Pittman Jr., honestly, getting a little bit of slot reps is something not to, turn your head at. But, Anthony Gould might be a sleeper to watch. Just the 5th-round pick out of Oregon State, primarily drafted for special teams reasons. But he has made some plays with Joe Flacco in the second unit this camp. Now, honestly, a lot of his plays have been vertical. And, he showed a little bit of that at Oregon State, of that big play potential. Downs is more of your, shifty, Welker, Edelman type of slot. So they're different styles, but, he would honestly be the name that I would watch just from sheer play time. For what it's worth, when Downs got hurt today, it was Gould who went into practice. Now, when you're game planning during a week, maybe you do, again, slide Pittman in there a little bit more. But I'd probably, Mitchell, Pierce, I just tend to think it's a little bit of, especially Mitchell, hasn't drilled at all at slot as a rookie. I tend to think those two are a little bit more on kind of a share load. I guess if you throw Pittman, into the slot and you play with two outside, maybe Pittman and Pierce could each do that. But that is a good question.
So all things healthy, right? Let's say Josh Downs is healthy. Where do you see the biggest weakness on this offense being? Because I think a lot of people think about the Colts offensive line, 4 years ago, being anchored by Quentin Nelson, and it was a dominant offensive line. And obviously he's still there, but it felt like there was a little bit of turnover, and it seemed that they hit on some pieces now to kind of like rejuvenate the offensive line. Like I said, I really like the receivers, Jonathan Taylor, Anthony Richardson. So if you had to like pinpoint a weakness here, is the easy answer just like tight end, although they don't really use him that much in the passing game anyways? Like where's your biggest concern based on the first like week or two of camp?
Yeah, I think from a fantasy standpoint, it's tight end, just because there's no clear cut. It's Kylan Granson, it's Drew Ogletree, it's Mo Alley Cox. You kind of got to wait a little even to see Jelani Woods, get really starting run here in camp. So I would point to that. I still think Richardson's got to prove himself as a thrower.
Yeah.
Certainly completion percentage won't wow you by any means from last season. But again, he had some explosive playmaking element. And like I said to you earlier, I didn't think they really did a whole lot vertically. And of course, him and Taylor in the backfield for 2 total snaps last season. And I think that element will be about as dynamic as any quarterback, running back, run threat in the league. So, the offensive line was really poor in 2022. They were much better in 2023, got back to that standard. I that's the assumption. If they got a little banged up there, it's a lot of young depth that they would have to rely on. But yeah, from a fantasy standpoint, it's probably just the lack of the outright tight end. I think Kylan Granson probably is taking the most starting reps here during camp, but still, I think it's a position that they'll sub in and out a whole lot.
Yeah, so I think the biggest question I have, and a lot of fantasy gamers have, is what happens on the goal line, right? Because we have Steichen coming over from Philly, and one of the toughest situations to really decipher is like, all right, DeAndre Swift was there last year, and he's not really getting goal line carries because, the tush push, and Jalen Hurts is scoring 15 rushing touchdowns. And it kind of feels like Anthony Richardson is going down that path. But you also have to imagine, like, they paid JT all this money. He's this bigger back who can push the entire pile. Have we seen a glimpse at camp of what that inside the 10, inside the 5, on the 1 yard line offense is going to look like? Should we expect Anthony Richardson to have the impact that Jalen Hurts has on the goal line, that Josh Allen has on the goal line, that like really actually starts to eat into the upside of Jonathan Taylor? Whereas a few years ago, JT might have been projected to score 18 or 20 rushing touchdowns and been one of the top fantasy running backs because of it. Now it's like he'll still be great, I'm sure, but there's a difference between scoring 9 or 10 rushing touchdowns and 17 or 18. So it feels like A-Rich is going to take a little bit of the sweetness off the top there.
Yeah, I think it's a real concern for Taylor owners, I guess, and not for Richardson owners. But yeah, I don't think it'll be in the QB sneak variety. Like, for example, the other day they got in a red zone period, and Richardson threw a fade to Pierce on second down, incomplete. Threw a pass to AD Mitchell on third down, incomplete. And here comes 4th and goal, and he keeps it off his own read and he scores. And it's just like, oh yeah, that is an element that Colts quarterbacks haven't had for decades. So yes, to answer your question, I do think that run threat certainly is, for lack of a better term, it's a kind of a cheat code at times, and it's certainly a forgotten element when you can stick it in the belly of Taylor. So yes, I fully expect, the zone read, the read options. I don't know if people remember last year in Week 18 against Houston on 4th and 1, the play of the game. Gardner Minshew threw the ball to Tyler Goodson in the flat.
Yeah.
I can assure you that will not be in the cards this season when they get into those 4th and 1s and critical moments. It's going to be Richardson with some sort of option off of it, period. You don't draft him at 4 overall without that. Now, you worry about durability and longevity and all of that. That's something you have to account for given his injuries from last season. And I think Shane Steichen looks at that and says, that's part of football. We're going to run him, and we're going to run him as much as I think we need to, week in and week out, and we'll live with the consequences on that. So that'll obviously be a storyline.
Okay, I won't hold you to it, but if you had to bet which of the two, Taylor or Richardson, scores more rushing touchdowns this year, where do you put your money?
Well, that's a good one. I might bet Taylor, just given his durability track record versus Richardson. I do think there's an element, which is kind of weird saying that for a running back, but, Taylor really outside of last season, he's been very durable, dating back to his Wisconsin days. Richardson, I still think there's a little bit of you got to prove it in that. But, my answer probably lends you to think, probably if they both were healthy for 17 weeks, maybe Richardson slightly over Taylor. But I think you have to think a little bit about the injuries.
Yeah, I mean, it's a scary combo on the goal line regardless. Behind Taylor, is there anything left for scraps? Do we expect him to come off in obvious passing situations? Off the top of my head, I'm not even sure, unless they pick someone up, who the backup would be to him, Evan Hull or someone down that path.
Yeah, I'd probably call Trey Sermon the first and second down backup. Now, nothing like Zach Moss was last year for this team, but I also think, Taylor could be right up there with any running back in the entire league in terms of highest percentage of carries within his team. When you look at the depth chart, again, you're paying him this money for a reason, and he just, he's currently wrapping up a very healthy training camp. So I don't expect much, maybe here's Sermon's carry, here's Sermon's series, but I don't expect it to be too abundant by any means. And Hall and Goodson, maybe they're a little bit of the third down stuff, but there's nothing obvious, from the days of Nyheim Hines to Zach Moss. The Colts have kind of had the other change of pace, different styles, of course, Hines and Moss, but they've kind of had that. I don't see it this obvious on this roster.
Okay. Yep. Just Taylor's world, and we're all living it. And I'll let you get back to the Colts world right now, because I know you guys got a lot going on during training camp. First preseason games right around the corner here. So, Kevin, just wanted to thank you for your time today. Really, really, really appreciate it. Everybody can go follow Kevin on Twitter. We've got his stuff linked down below. It's at kbowen1070. Any parting words or hot takes or bold predictions for the year that you want to throw out on record before you leave?
Boy, gosh.
You don't have to if I put you on the spot there, but just in case.
I guess I could come with a little bit of juice. Let's go with Latu, the rookie, to have 9 sacks. I don't know. 9 might not seem like a huge number, but if you look at past rushers in year 1, that's a lot. So we'll go there.
All right. We've got it. The rookie DN is going to make some noise this year. Thank you again, Kevin. I'll talk to you later.
All right, Nick. Thanks for having me, man.